cybersecurity. So what I want to do is I'm going to run you through some conceptual models around how I think about cybersecurity. I'll then run you through effectively a attack chain for how organizations are compromised. I think that's important to understand so that effectively you can kind of factor that into your risk discussions that you would be having with your own organizations. I'll run you through some of the trends and themes that we're seeing from the latest KPMG reports looking at this space. I'll also run through, which hopefully you'll find interesting, some of the current industry trends that we're seeing on. So I'll talk a little about what we've been seeing because of the Ukraine-Russia event that's going on at the moment. And as part of that, I'll talk about the things that you should be thinking about and talking about within your organizations. And then finally, I'll leave you with a little bit of a thought piece around where potentially cybersecurity risk management might be heading and some of the things we might need to think about in the future. And then I've left ample time for questions. So as we go along, if you do have any questions, do pop them in the chat, or feel free to ask them at the end of the session. From previous sessions that I've done, I find that's really valuable for everyone on the call. So don't be afraid to ask a question. There's no silly questions in this space. So in terms of effectively, just a bit about where I work at the moment. So I currently work at KPMG, effectively as Director of Cybersecurity there. This is our mission statement overall. So we're very focused on making sure that we fuel the prosperity of New Zealanders and in everything that we do. So the reason I always highlight this is it's just one of the kind of cultural reasons for me being there, because I think it's important that everyone benefits as a country and as a New Zealander. And part of doing these sessions is also to make sure that we all think about cybersecurity in a way that makes sense, and we all benefit from kind of having collective knowledge. And I'm certainly a firm believer that it's not about hiding any knowledge on cybersecurity, and it's actually about demystifying this whole topic, because hopefully, as you'll see as we go through this presentation, this is really a risk management conversation, and all of you being risk professionals or involved in that space more broadly should hopefully be able to translate some of the concepts that I'm talking about today to your own day-to-day jobs. I always think it's a good idea to know about the person you're speaking to you. So just giving you a little bit of background on me. So the picture on the top left there, I'm an avid trail runner. So that's my last trail race that I did before COVID got in the way, where I did a 43-kilometer trail race. If you know the Wellington region, I ran over the Rim Attackers just for fun. It took me about 7 hours and 15 minutes, I think it was. So, but that's what I do to de-stress. So you'll often find me in the hills around Wellington at the weekend. The diagram on the right, and you can probably see behind me, an avid collector of Lego, although my wife's now limiting the amount of Lego sets that I can have out in the house. So I've got a few out in my office, but the rest of the house is a no Lego zone anymore. And there's a lot of Lego stored in my garage downstairs, which is probably taking up way too much space. I've got a 3-year-old son, so I spend a lot of time reading children's books to him, and he's a good kind of, settler after a long day of work, of realizing that from a 3-year-old's perspective, they don't really care what you do, they just want you to read them a book. Also, when I can get a chance to do a bit of gaming on the Xbox, and then in the middle, cybersecurity, both from a professional perspective, but also from a personal perspective. So I do a lot of reading around the topic outside of work, just because I've always found it interesting. I've got a degree in technology and information systems. So I think just to give you some context and starting with some definitions on cybersecurity, you can go out there and you can find a lot of different definitions on cybersecurity, and I've highlighted a few on the page here. The one that I like the best out of these four is the one from CISA in the US, which effectively states that cybersecurity is the art of protecting networks, devices, and data from unauthorized access or criminal use, and the practice of ensuring confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. It's a bit more wordy, but the reason that I like it is actually it talks about what cybersecurity is about. And for this group of risk professionals, you can see that it really is talking about managing a risk. And one of the thematics you'll see throughout this presentation from me is that cybersecurity ultimately is a risk management conversation. And it's up to us as risk professionals to make sure that our organizations understand what their cybersecurity risk posture is, what their appetite is for cybersecurity, and then the controls and processes that they're going to put in place to manage that. And in a minute, we'll talk about some analogies that might help you with having that conversation with your own organizations. But some advice from my perspective, if you're talking to people about cybersecurity and they're making it sound very technical and very complex, to be frank, that's not really where the conversation needs to be these days. It needs to be a risk management conversation, because it's very similar to managing other risks you'll have in your organization, be that operational, compliance, business continuity, health and safety, etc. Right? So this is really a risk management conversation, and it's something that we're going to have to keep having within our organizations. It's not something that you can treat and it's fully mitigated. It's going to exist with us for a long period of time. So how can you have those conversations within your own organization? So there's two analogies that I use a lot when I'm training boards and executives and I'm talking to senior stakeholders, and I'll run you through those now. So the first analogy that I use a lot is when I'm starting doing some training and hoping to kind of educate people on this, the first thing that I actually say to them is, look, if you want 99% safety of your systems, i.e. they won't be compromised or exploited by attackers, switch them off, put them in a cave somewhere in New Zealand, pile up some rocks in the front of them, and hope that the tramper doesn't stumble across those systems when they're out and about for a walk. Now, obviously, that gives the obvious reaction where they go, well, but then we don't have a business model. And that's the whole point of the first analogy, right? So effectively being able to be connected to the outside world as organizations means we need to use technology, and by its nature, it will mean that we will always have some level of risk around cybersecurity threats to our organizations. And so it's a really important message for boards and executives and the leadership teams of organizations to understand, because from experience, what has happened in the industry over the last kind of 10 to 15 years is there's been a bit of culture of trying to kind of say, well, if you put this solution in, it will fully mitigate your cyber compromise risk, and you'll be nice and safe, and you'll never be compromised. That is just not the world that we live in. Even with all of the security capabilities that you may put in place in an organization to protect it from attacks, you will still have a risk of being compromised, because if someone has enough motive, money and time, they will eventually find a way into your organization. So that's a really important message for organizations to understand and move away from this kind of silver bullet mentality around solutions. The second analogy that I talk about a lot, and I started out my career working for Ford Motor Company, which is probably why I'm a little bit obsessed with cars, is effectively, if you think about the investment in cybersecurity and risk management and mitigation, the analogy that I use a lot is around the transport sector. If we all agree that a car predominantly is designed to get you from point A to point B, when we're making a decision around trying to achieve that objective, we can either buy the car on the left, which is effectively, $500 potentially, beaten up, the tire's flat, doesn't work all the time, doesn't have the best safety features, etc. Or we can go top of the range, buy the Tesla Model 3 on the right there, and it's, you can find it on your phone. It's got lane departure assistance detection. It automatically drives itself. It's got amazing security features, etc., etc., etc. And so for organizations, when you think about that analogy from a cybersecurity risk perspective, we can probably all agree that we don't want to be the car on the left. But at the same time, not every organization needs to be the car on the right, because ultimately what you're trying to work out here is a risk appetite. How much investment do you want to put in managing your cybersecurity risk to allow you to achieve your objectives? And for some organizations, they absolutely have to be the top right. For a lot of organizations, they probably need to be in the top third. And so that's what you've got to kind of help organizations understand is, what is your threat profile from a cybersecurity perspective, and how much do you want to invest? And a good example of that might be, if we go back a few years, traditionally, you might have been an organization that only has bricks and mortar type stores. So the investment in a significant amount of DDoS capabilities to prevent your website being taken offline is probably not a big deal for an organization that really cares about the amount of foot traffic through its physical buildings. Whereas an organization that relies fully on online presence to do its business, a good example in New Zealand in the last 2 years has been when we saw the NZX go out because of a DDoS attack, probably needs to be investing significantly in its preventative capabilities to stop its websites going offline. However, coming back to the first analogy, their executive board still needs to understand that that doesn't give you 100% protection. And so ultimately with these two analogies, what we're trying to do is change the thinking around those boards and executives to ultimately get to a point where they realize this is ongoing risk management, and I need to prioritize my investment and my controls and my capabilities based on my appetite as an organization and the business model that I'm running. Feel free to use those analogies if they work for you as much as possible. The more we do that with our boards and executives, the better it will be for New Zealand overall as a country. So then if we move on to how do you attack an organization, and I'm going to break an illusion from the Hollywood movies. It is not as quick as it looks like in the movies where someone taps the keyboard for 5-10 minutes and they're in. They're usually wearing a hoodie, which we kind of find quite funny. I've got pictures of me in a hoodie just to kind of create the illusion, but ultimately it's not like the movies. It takes a long period of time to attack an organization. Now, the text on these slides is quite small because I was trying to fit quite a bit of information on these slides. We'll share them after this presentation. But what I'm showing here is there's a framework that's accessible online to everyone called the MITRE attack framework, not to be confused with the MITRE stores in New Zealand. They're not running cybersecurity training. And effectively, that framework outlines how you attack an organization. And if I just run you through the kind of basic steps here, you'll start to get a feel for that. So the pre-attack stage, this is all about getting ready to attack an organization. And so similar to what we might do in our own organizations, these attackers will have a planning meeting, or they'll get together, and through kind of steps 2 and 3 here is that they'll work out who they want to target and attack, right? Because ultimately, if you come back to the previous analogy, if they want to attack any organization, they'll eventually get in. But ultimately, if your organization's in that top third of the car analogy, it's a hard organization to compromise, they may want to go for someone who's in the bottom 2/3 of that analogy. And so once they've selected that target, they're then getting into the information gathering stage. So they're going to go out in steps 4 and 5, and they're going to gather information on your technical capabilities. So they might do a scan of your perimeter to look at what systems you've got. They'll be checking your social media posts, understand who your people are, and maybe the susceptibilities to get into your organization by people. They're getting out and understanding how your organization is structured, which third-party suppliers you're using. Those scans that they're doing in your perimeter are looking for, technical weaknesses, interfaces that may be exposed that they could exploit. Same with your people. And then ultimately they're getting to kind of those steps, stages 11 and 12, where effectively they're starting to then go out and purchase the infrastructure and build the infrastructure that they need to attack you, developing fake personas to basically try and connect with your people online, and then testing all those capabilities and then getting ready to go. And so the reason that that's important to understand is there's an investment here from these people to get into your organization. So they want to get in because either they want to steal intellectual property, they want to shut your systems down so they can hold you under a ransomware and ask you to pay money. They might want to encrypt your data so they can ask you to pay money, or there might be a political motivation where they want to take your systems offline for political reasons. But there's a lot of planning and everything that goes into this. And all of these people involved in this have different performance targets and objectives that they have to meet. And also they're often outsourcing some of these capabilities. So for example, you can go on the dark web if you're so inclined, and you can buy a DDoS attack, which is to take offline a company's website for $400 US, and they'll do that for you for 24 hours. And from what we can tell, their support and help desk is really, really good, right? And so if you're not getting it working, you can drop them a message to the support line and they'll help you out, right? So ultimately, these people are running a business. They're just on the business of compromising organizations. So once they've done all that, which is like setting up your project, then we're into the attack stage. And this is the part where, like I said with my analogy, this is not, like in the movies within 5 to 10 minutes. It is getting quicker, and that's because technology is becoming more standardized, more as a relying on cloud-based services, but it is still a significant amount of time to kind of work through this. And so when they're attacking an organization, what they're looking to do initially is they're looking to establish that initial access to your organization. Now, historically, the way they've done that is through effectively phishing emails, getting your people to click on links, which then allows them to connect to that person's computer. And then if they've effectively got a poor setup of that computer, then they're establishing a foothold. However, that is not the easy way, because once you're in there, you've still got to establish something called persistence, which is where you need to be able to come and go into the organization as much as you please. And so because you want to do your exploration of this organization you're attacking and make sure that you're able to kind of get in and take a break and come back when you need to. And so persistence is actually really hard to establish. And so they have to look at kind of things where if your person switches off the computer, when they re-switch it back on, there's a script that runs in the background to re-establish that connection. And so that takes a bit of time, right? So that's why not every link you click on in a phishing email will automatically mean that they've got persistent access to your environment. as a side tangent briefly, one of the most interesting persistent establishments a few years back was there was a telecommunications company in Europe, and through doing a review of their network, they came across what's called a virtual private network. So just that's a permanent connection into the company's network, and no one in the networks team knew what it was, but they'd been moving it for like 3 or 4 years. Every time they did some network changes, they always recreated that connection. Turns out that was a permanent network connection to an attacker, alleged to be state-owned. So think, your Chinas, your Russias, etc. And that had been there for 3 or 4 years. And the attacker was coming and going into the organization as they pleased. Now, they hadn't done anything in terms of stealing data or taking systems offline, but it turns out what they were doing is they were using the telecommunications company's records to monitor persons of interest. So thinking, accessing text messages, phone calls, etc. And this had been going on for a good 3 to 5 years. And so that's just, an example where it's not always about causing immediate damage, but it's a very smart way. And, the importance of, your control environment around actually testing things correctly and not just assuming, well, that network connection's always been there, so surely it's fine. So once they've got persistence in the organization, what they're looking for is they're looking to get what's called privileged access or escalation. So for most of us with our computers, when we log in every day, we've got access to Outlook and Words, and a few other applications. Those aren't really the accounts that you can do a lot of damage to an organization for. What they're ultimately trying to get to is what's called privileged accounts that are mainly stored within the technology teams to give them access to the back-end systems that you're running. So think direct access to your databases, the ability to take your systems offline. And so that can take a while because they have to move around the organization trying to acquire that access. And as well they're doing that, what they're having to do is invade any defensive capabilities that you might have to protect against cyber attacks. And so through kind of stages 5, 6, and 7, and 8, that's all about kind of trying to evade those defenses, move around your organization, understand what's there, and hopefully get to that intellectual property or the ability to take your systems offline. Finally, in the final few steps of this, they're then really kind of trying to establish what they want to do and either collect your data, get ready to take your systems offline, and create the infrastructure to do that. And then finally, in step 12, they do the impact. So that's, when it hits the media and there's a lot of attention and a lot of regulatory oversight, depending on the organization that you work for. And so, again, I think reason for sharing these is when you're talking with, people around, the cybersecurity risk, having an appreciation that this is around a process that has to happen to compromise an organization. There are layers of controls that have to be compromised by these attackers to get there. And the importance of those layers and making sure that you're comfortable with them and they're being tested appropriately, that's really, an important part of a risk professional's role, and ultimately is a risk management conversation. We're back to kind of where we started to with the presentation. So if we then talk about global trends and areas to consider, so we did a report recently, which is available on that link there, to look at what the main trends are that we think are going to happen in the cybersecurity space. So just running through these, and some of these are obvious because they're trends within other areas, but there's a few specifics to call out here as well. So number one, as I've talked about in the previous few slides, the importance of expanding the strategic conversation on security. And if boards and executives in your organization isn't able to articulate what their cybersecurity threat profile is, how maybe they're approaching this around their strategy, then as risk professionals, there's some opportunities for us to work with these organizations to kind of help them uplift their overall capabilities. And for me personally, why that's important is I want New Zealand to be seen as a hard target and not a weak target, right? And then the more we can do that as a country, the better it is for everyone, because they'll get bored and they'll go and attack another country. I think the second item, which we're seeing in multiple industries, is just critical staff shortages. It's particularly pronounced in the cybersecurity space. I'm constantly trying to hire people at the moment, and it's a very, very tough market. It's not something we're going to easily solve. So there's going to have to just be ongoing investment in training and upskilling people. Number 3 is really important, especially now for New Zealand. We're starting to see Microsoft through their Azure data center, and then Amazon Web Services looking to set up data centers within New Zealand in the next couple of years. That'll mean that we'll have local cloud presence available to a lot of organizations. And with that, naturally will come a desire to leverage those capabilities. And we're going to have to make sure that we do that in a secure and safe way. I think cloud's a real opportunity for a lot of organizations because you benefit from a whole industry trying to secure this thing called cloud. And as the cloud security gets better, you naturally benefit from that. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. I think the one thing where sometimes organizations forget with cloud is the way the model is structured is, yes, the cloud provider has responsibilities, but there is absolutely a set of responsibilities that each organization needs to have in place as well. So making sure that we're across those as organizations, we understand the controls we're accountable for, and they're on our risk registers and we're testing them is a really, really important area to focus on. Identity is going to become really important. So we're moving away from traditional organizations, predominantly driven by cloud, where you used to have a secure perimeter, and then what you did inside your organization, it was okay if it wasn't perfect. As we move to more distributed use of things like cloud, making sure we know who is accessing our systems, why they're accessing them, and then removing people that shouldn't have access to them is going to be really, really important. And the controls around that space are going to have to be really well understood and tested. Security automation is coming, and in a minute I'll talk about some of the examples around what that could look like, but we're going to continue to see automation, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, that will result in better risk management, and ultimately if we can automate our controls and automate our responses, the better it is for everyone. Privacy is going to be really important. So as we get more and more technology and we continue to see kind of layers upon layers of technology being built and introduced, I think considering privacy, and certainly privacy and security go hand in hand, is going to be really essential for our organizations to get our heads around, and being clear on, in the event that you do have a privacy breach, can you demonstrate, you're taking security appropriately, you've got the appropriate response plans in place. Securing boundaries. So really what we're talking about here is third parties. So if we're going to keep leveraging third parties to deliver a number of our services, then we're going to have to make sure that those are secure. And again, as a bit of a tangent here, you may have heard in the last couple of years, probably one of the best third-party security compromises we've seen, and credit to the people that did this, although it's a little bit scary. There was a network monitoring technology called SolarWinds, which is provided by this company of the same name. And so what that technology does is lots of organizations around the world use this technology to monitor the status of their networks to make sure that it's up and information is flowing around. The attacker was able to compromise SolarWinds as an organization. And what they did is they got all the way through to the software development part of the organization, and they injected malicious code into the network monitoring software. And so then as customers pulled down the latest update of that software and installed it on their environments, that malicious code was installed. It then sat there dormant for a few weeks, and then it effectively started to try and call home. And for organizations that maybe didn't have the right capabilities in place, i.e. allowing servers to connect directly to the internet, that software was able to connect and allow that attacker direct access into those organizations. And so that's an example of why third-party supply management and who you use and who you work with is becoming such a focus in the cybersecurity space, because that's a pretty smart way to do it. Could compromise, hundreds, potentially thousands of organizations. Imagine if that attacker had been able to do that with Microsoft Windows update process, which we all use to keep our systems up to date, both personally or organizationally. So third-party supply management will continue to be a factor, driven by the fact that we continue to kind of use things like cloud as well. And then finally, point 8, reframing the cyber resilience conversation. So that's really what I've touched about earlier on in this presentation. We've got to stop having conversations around this is a zero-sum game. If we do all these things, we're fully protected. Focus on the fact that we need to do as much as we can within our appetites to protect our organizations, and be prepared to respond to an attack if it does happen. And so having practiced that and running that through your executives and boards is a really, really valuable thing you can do based on my personal experience. Okay, for a couple more slides, and I'm more than happy to take questions. So I wanted to just do a bit of a deep dive on some of the security incidents that we've seen in the last kind of 4 weeks, and just kind of talk to you around the way that I think about them when I read about them. So a few weeks back, we saw that VMware, which is an organization that provides a lot of the virtual desktop environment. So, when you access your desktop from a home computer and it brings up a virtual version of Windows, they had a number of vulnerabilities in their system that could be compromised very quickly by an attacker. And it turns out that those vulnerabilities had been in place for about a year. And so this is one of the challenges with the cybersecurity space is we refer to these things as zero-day vulnerabilities. And usually what that means is that they're there, they could be being exploited by someone, and they're 0 day until someone who's legitimate picks up and goes, oh, we should do something about that, usually the software company. And so when we're thinking about vulnerabilities of our software and our systems, what you should be expecting to see when you're discussing these with your wider organizations is, do we actually understand all the systems that we have in place within our organization? Because if we don't have that understanding, then how do we know if we're exposed to all of these vulnerabilities? So you would expect to see some type of asset register across your organization that covers things like, your software you have, the hardware you have, the network devices you have, etc. Then realistically, you're getting into what you'd expect to see around processes. So do we have processes in place to identify the vulnerabilities? So, are we connected into information sharing channels, for example, CERT New Zealand? Are we getting a process in place when these vulnerabilities come in for us to go, does that apply to our system? No, it doesn't. And then also, do we understand how quickly we need to resolve these vulnerabilities? So some vulnerabilities we might need to treat within 24 hours, others because maybe they're protected by the security capabilities, we might be okay to maybe take 1 week or 2 weeks, depending on the appetite of the organization. And then how does the organization understand if it's accepting vulnerabilities that can't be treated? There's always a situation where sometimes you can't treat a vulnerability. It may be that by treating that vulnerability, means that system can no longer function, and therefore, in those situations, does your board and executive sign off on that? So that's vulnerabilities. The other interesting thing we saw a few weeks back, and this was in the lead up to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, is we started to see oil ports in Germany be taken offline by an attacker. And so it disrupted the unloading of barges in many of the ports, and therefore affected the supply chain of oil into Germany. And so, potentially yet to be confirmed, but, you could read state-owned attacker there. And so this is a good example of, and using that within your organizations, of do you understand effectively the threat scenarios you're trying to protect against? Obviously, in this instance, being unable to deliver oil and impacting the supply chain, that's the threat scenario you're worried about from a cybersecurity perspective. If you do understand your threat scenario, do you know how you respond to that? And have you tested that and run that through with your stakeholders? Do you have communication plans in place that articulate how you would communicate to the market and how you go about that? And from experience, what we've seen is, without having had that conversation up front, the initial reaction for most people is to over-communicate and overreact with that communication process, which then gets them into a lot of trouble because the cybersecurity event might be changing quite rapidly and you're putting facts into the market that might not be correct. And then have you actually thought about, if we did lose our systems, can we recover from our backups? Are they well protected? How would we do that? How quickly can we do that? Another good example, which we saw over the last few weeks, is Anonymous, who's, if you look at kind of cybersecurity attack groups, they're one of the big ones in the world. For a long time, they've been attacking lots of organizations around the world. Because of effectively what they saw in Russia, they decided to support Ukraine, and they started attacking Russian websites and taking them offline, took offline around 300 Russian websites in about 48 hours. And so this is a good example where, you can assume something and then quickly the environment can change. I don't think necessarily Russia was thinking that Anonymous would kind of pivot to start attacking them directly, but they did because their members fully support the Ukraine position. So again, here's another example where when you're thinking about this, do you understand the security capabilities in place to protect against things like that? Have you got threat scenarios understood and communicated? And do you need to adjust any of your security capabilities? Because the world will keep moving, and therefore you should expect that your control environment will continue to mature as the outside scenarios change. And then finally, two closer to home. So we saw last September against the financial sector a DDoS attack against a number of organizations. A DDoS attack is where you are trying to take offline an organization's digital presence, so their website predominantly. The way you do that is you overflood that website with requests for a copy of the page, which means that eventually it gets kind of overwhelmed and legitimate people can't get to it. And so that's what a DDoS attack does at a kind of summary level. Now, we thought DDoS attacks had disappeared probably a year or two away, but they've come back with a vengeance. And so when we're thinking about this as an example, does your organization need to defend against DDoS attacks? Coming back to my previous example around the shop, if you're a bricks and mortar based organization, probably not interested if your website goes offline. If the NZX, absolutely you're interested if your website goes online. If you do need them, have you reviewed the capabilities? Do you know that they can stand up to the latest attack volumes that we're seeing? And again, what are your communication strategies in the event that your service still goes offline? Because these capabilities to defend against it are not a perfect silver bullet solution. And then finally, we saw, I think it's probably coming up to about a year and a half ago now, the Reserve Bank data breach, where one of their third parties applications they were using effectively was breached by an attacker. So from an organizational perspective, do you understand what data you've got? What's your most critical data? Have you protected that adequately? Who has access to it? Do you monitor for data loss events? Could you pick up if someone had stolen your data? And again, what's your communication strategy if it does happen? Because I'm never going to say to any of you that this is not something that could happen to you based on what you've got in place. It's something that could happen to any organization if that attack has got enough motive and time. So hopefully that just gives you a flavor of kind of using these security incidents and thinking about your own organizations. And hopefully you can see very clearly that a lot of those questions we're asking are the standard things we would ask around building our risk management, risk and control profiles. Right, and then hopefully this will work. So we're done. Just give me a minute. All right, so finally, if I can get this to work. Okay. Just give me a minute. All right, you're watching me use technology now. Just bear with me because this is a really good example.
If you're over the age of 35, this is how much earwax is trapped in your ears right now.
So hopefully you can see that now. Can you see that, Karen? Okay, so this is a game from the 80s, and the purpose of the game was to basically move this cat around and turn all those squares yellow. And so they set artificial intelligence a task to try and get the highest score. And so you can see it playing the game at the moment. And now it started flashing all the boxes. And so the game's not meant to do that. And as you can see there in the top right, the score's just going up and up and up. And so it turns out what the artificial intelligence did is its objective was to get the highest score. And so it found a code vulnerability, and the flashing boxes are effectively exploiting the code vulnerability. And this video goes for another 20 minutes, right? And it just gets the highest score ever in the game. Usually what happens is you complete all the squares and you move to the next level. And so why I like sharing this is, although we're in an infancy at the moment around artificial intelligence, the artificial intelligence did what it was told to do, which is to get the highest score. If you translate this to kind of where we might be heading in the future around cybersecurity, telling an artificial intelligence to compromise an organization, it doesn't need to sleep. it can cheat, it can look for vulnerabilities that we might not even be aware of. And so we might end up in the future where we'll have to kind of have capabilities that respond to artificial intelligence trying to attack our organizations and compromise our assets. So that's, you know, an interesting example as a thought piece. I personally hope it's a lot further away than I think it could be. And, you know, I'd be happy if it was 10, 20 years away, because it adds a whole nother layer to protecting our systems. But then when you think about how we're layered upon all of our kind of society and economies on technology, we're going to have to potentially respond to something like this in the future. And so, yeah, just a really good thought piece to kind of think about. I'll just go back to the presentation. All right, there we go. So thank you for bearing with me while I sorted that out. My security settings obviously didn't allow me to play that video. All right, so look, finally from me, happy to open up questions. I've got a QR link on there which will take you to my LinkedIn profile if you want to connect with me and send me any messages after this session. But now, Kerry, over to you in the group, and happy to take any questions. And please do ask anything that you want to know. That's what I'm here to do.
Fabulous. Thanks very much, Tony. So there are a couple of questions in the chat function. Can we start with those and then go through to the floor? Fabulous. So if we start at the top, let me just see how we go here. Who at senior executive level should own cyber risk? Is it primarily an IT systems resilience issue, or should it sit with executive who owns the confidential and private data and information being held in the system and being targeted by cyber criminals?
Great question, and not, to be honest, not an easy question to answer. I'll try and talk about the things to think about, mainly because it is a factor of your organization and your size. You know, if personally I could have my own way, every organization would have a head of security or a CISO role, but realistically that's not achievable. One, because we don't have enough people in the market to fill all those roles, and secondly, you know, the organization might not warrant having a dedicated role in that space. However, your question around the technology versus, you know, if someone owns the data, my personal view is it is not a technology only responsibility. If you can't understand your data and what's important to you, which very much sits usually within those business type roles, then how can you ensure that you're protecting it appropriately? And a good example of that is if you had a ransomware situation tomorrow where someone compromised your organization, encrypted your data, you need to understand both the technology aspects of how they've done that, but more importantly, what data have they encrypted? Is it our most important data? What sequence do we need to recover that data in? And so very much it needs to be an organizational wide understanding. And that's why at the beginning, I talk very much around the board and executive owning cybersecurity, similar to how they would own the health and safety risk that you all have within your organizations.
If we haven't answered the questions fully, please just raise your hand and just add to the chat function. Question number 2, if you have a mature BCP capability for DR situations, how do you recommend managing looking at BCP for a cyber situation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So BCP and DR is a really important part of recovery. And so if you've got a mature practice in that space already, you're already well along the lines of getting to a good outcome. However, from my experience, the BCP DR is tended to focus on with the assumption that you've got availability to your technology systems, i.e. System X goes down, we can move it to our DR site, back up, bring that back up, fix it. I think what you have to look at with cyber attacks is, depending on what they're looking to do, and let's assume they want to take your systems offline, you have to look at your BCP and DR processes with that threat scenario in mind. So if someone took off a suite of our systems, could we recover from that attack? And how would we do that? And I think what you would find is, if you ran that through your organizations, and some of you maybe already have done this and be in a good position, you might find that things like, have we backed up our Active Directory, which a lot of organizations have in place to allow access to their systems, because if they take that offline, you can't even get to your systems. Have we backed up the configuration of our system? So it's all very well if we have the hot mentality, but if we lose both, do we have the configuration settings backed up so that we can rebuild the system, the access management settings, etc.? And then do we also understand the how the data is currently backed up and located, and is that secure, or could the attacker get to that and pull that out? So I think it's using that BCP DR base that you've got, but then overlaying that threat scenario. And I think what you'll find is a different set of actions that you may need to think about. The only other thing I would add to with BCP and DR is, do not probably get pulled into the mentality, I need to recover everything. Because if you're in a cybersecurity situation and you've got a loss of access to your systems, you need to be able to identify what are the most critical systems for you to recover to allow your business to function. And that's a really important piece of knowledge to have as an organization.
One of the things that I find quite fascinating actually is where people sort of start preparing for a cyber attack, but they go, well, actually, like our plans are on our intranet. And or they're on our network, and we go, we'll just refer to those. Well, actually, what happens if the network or the intranet is down? So then what are you going to do? The other learning that I've had in the last couple of years is that people have been thinking that it's only going to have a very short-term impact, and so the planning is not for a longer period of time. And so if it is that you're without systems for an extended period of time, what would business operations look like in that scenario? And I think people haven't really sort of extended their planning process to that scenario.
Yeah. Well, Kerry, and Waikato DHB is a good example, right? That went on for months. Right?
I wasn't going to say anything.
Yeah. But it's a good example.
It's mentioned.
Yeah, and I've only read about it in the media, so I don't have any insight onto that. But I feel for people on that, and that's a long period of time. You have to think about the people well-being as well, right? Because it's a long period of time to operate at high pressure.
Correct. Yep. So question number 3, thank you for clear and helpful information. How do you recommend to manage third-party risks for organizations? For example, if cybersecurity compromised from a third party provided, how can a company protect itself?
Yeah, good question. It's one that comes up a lot, right? So by no means am I saying don't use third parties, right? We've got to all benefit from that. There's a lot of value in it. I think the way that I've approached it in the past is to think about, in the event that that third party was compromised and it had an impact on my organization, could I demonstrate that I had enough oversight of that third party? So, the extreme example is, you probably don't want to be in a situation where you set up the third party arrangement and you've never monitored it all in your life, and it's only now that you've remembered that you've got them because your data's been compromised. Mm-hmm. So some of the things to think about there is, depending on the type of third party, are you having clauses in there that kind of stipulate the security requirements? And that can include, the standards they meet. If they have an incident, how quickly they have to notify you, 48 hours or whatever you deem to be appropriate. And if they report that to a regulator, do they have to notify as well, right? So, because what you're trying to demonstrate to your customers or clients is, actually, no, we did care and we took it seriously. So contracts, security clauses, those type of things, absolutely important. Depending on the type of third party, are you reviewing their security status on a regular basis, right? That might be reviewing what in the industry is called the SOC 2 report for the security cloud providers, or it might be commissioning an independent review of their security posture, because you have the right to do that under the contract. And that's not necessarily something you could have in place for every third party, because each third party you might have to negotiate with. And then finally, I think you could go to a level where, are you monitoring for data breaches in that third party by looking more broadly across the industry and the news and seeing what's going on. But the kind of short answer to that is, have a defensible position to demonstrate that you were monitoring that third party, and that people would go, oh, that seems reasonable that you were doing that, and yeah, it's annoying it's happened, but you were trying to do everything right.
Yeah, one of the things that we've also found is where we've got an arrangement with a third party provider, and staff have to set up an account of sorts. And so what they've done is use their work email address and their normal network password to log on to that third party provider. And then what's happened is that the third party provider has had a security breach, and the risk is that actually the credentials that actually could access our internal systems are now on the dark web. So that's the other issue around making sure that your staff don't use their network credentials for third party systems.
Yeah. Or they use them at Pizza Hut. website, and then Peter gets compromised, and then eventually they've got, yeah. So it's a really simple, it's something that often gets messed with passwords, is if you use the same password across your personal and work life, then if I compromise Peter, Peter hasn't been compromised as far as I know, effectively, I can then just run your password against your work client. And actually, it's one of the ways that, you know, they got in initially when we all started working from home from COVID, because a lot of organizations didn't set up MFA, and then they would just do lots of these passwords against your email address for work. So yeah, really, really important to not have staff using the same password everywhere.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the end of the questions. I have one that I'm hoping that you can answer, Tony. So in my experience, there are a number of government organizations that actually are really helpful in this space. Who would you suggest that if there is an incident, what organizations would you approach for support?
Yeah, great question. So there's two broad organizations here. Number one is CERT New Zealand. So effectively, if you go to their website, they've got some really good collateral on, you know, what organizations should be thinking about in terms of doing the basics on cybersecurity well. The other one, which will depend on your size of your organization, is the National Cyber Security Centre. And so they tend to work with organizations at the bigger end of town where they've had a cyber compromise breach, and they can come in and help you assist and recover. Obviously, they're resource constrained, so that they do have to limit who they do and don't work with. In terms of the police, more from a reporting of these things if there's been an actual crime involved, you know, and that's always good to get the data. But yeah, National Cyber Security Centre and CERT are the main two that I would be engaging with.
Perfect. So I'm happy to open the questions up to the floor. If you want to just unmute. Hi, Andre.
Hi, thanks. Sorry, I'm chipping in to get in before you finish. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. Go for it. Go for gold.
Yeah, Tony, sorry, I had to step out. The boss called, and I wasn't sure whether my typed questions was addressed. I missed about 10 minutes, so I'll check it on the recording going back. But my question was basically, I work for Auckland Council. We got top risks, which is public information, and the Audit and Risk Committee agendas and stuff. And we have IT security and the IT systems as one top risk. And then we have data and information, the confidential and private information of our customers as well as our staff. We constantly sort of tossing and turning, where does cyber risk own if we have to get one executive team leader to own it? Is it on the IT resilience side, or IT system side, or is it on the data side? We landed it on the IT system side, but I just wanted your opinion, Tony.
Carrie, can you help us as well? So Andre, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can still hear you. There's a bit of music, but it's all good.
I think someone's gone on hold or something.
Yeah.
So I'll try and work through it.
Let me just transfer back on. I should be able to fix that. Let me just see.
We're being monitored.
Sorry, I can't actually see who's not on mute here. Can everybody just make sure you're on mute?
Yeah.
I fixed it because it's actually me. YouTube decided to play video. Sorry, Andre.
No worries.
Oh, good. Yeah, so we did answer that, but just recapping on that. Effectively, I think the challenge with this is it does depend on the organisation. But my short answer to it was that the executive board needs to own this as much as they would own health and safety, which is a joint ownership piece. Certainly, you're right. There's definitely, cybersecurity, technology systems, data management. They're all connected in this space because attackers are effectively trying to steal data, take systems offline, etc. So that one understanding across organizations is important here. And I think, often what I see as well is that people start getting into things like, but should we call it cybersecurity risk or information loss or data loss? Ultimately each organization just needs to make a call on that. And I would say come back to what is the cyber threat that we're trying to avoid here, and what's our threat profile as an organization? And you know, for your organization, you might say, well, we're worried about data being stored. That's the most stolen. That's the most important thing for us to mitigate. Or it might be that government services are taken offline. Understand that. And then from that, you work forward and say, well, how do we protect against that from this thing called cyber? The problem with cyber is it's a very much a buzzword at the moment. Ultimately, this is about security and protection of information. Is the vernacular I tend to use. The cyber is the buzzword, kind of summarizes it all together.
Yeah. No, great. Yeah. No, we landed it on the ELT member with IT under her belt. But we have risk sponsors, and then directly below them risk leads, which actually do the job. And we had the IT director covering risk lead to cover both the data and the system side of it, to sort of bridge that gap that it's interlinked and mixed. Yeah. Thank you.
Right, no worries.
Any other questions? So as Tony said, we will be sharing the presentation from today. Again, Tony, thank you so much for taking the time out to share the hour with us. Just from a RIMS perspective, we have a number of training opportunities that are absolutely free and some really great speakers scheduled. So if you wouldn't mind just going through to our LinkedIn page, all the details are there, and happy to share with your teams. If there are no further questions, I'm happy to close off the session. Have a fabulous day, everybody, and I hope you have had some value from the session. Thanks, everybody. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Tony.
Cheers.